Today we'll have something completely different. It's still going to be a fairy tale, but for all of those of you who believe that all the fairy tales have been written many of hundreds of years ago, that's not the case, not at all. There is, for example, a Russian author by the name of Ludmilla Petrushevskaya who writes very impressive, very dark, very, very scary fairy tales. This one is from a collection called There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbor's Baby. This particular story is called The Arm. During the war, a colonel received a letter from his wife. She misses him very much, it said, and won't he come to visit because she's worried she'll die without having seen him. The colonel applied for leave right away, and as it happened that just a few days earlier he'd been awarded a medal, he was granted 3 days. He got a plane home, but just an hour before his arrival his wife died. He wept, buried his wife, and got on a train back to his base. And then suddenly discovered he had lost his party card. He dug through all his things, returned to the train station, all this with great difficulty, but couldn't find it. Finally, he just went home. There he fell asleep and dreamed that he saw his wife, who said that his party card was in her coffin. It had fallen out when the colonel bent over to kiss her during the funeral. In his dream, his wife also told the colonel not to lift the veil from her face. The colonel did as he was told. He dug up the coffin, opened it, and found his party card inside. But then he couldn't resist. He lifted the covering from his wife's face. She lay there as if still alive, but there was a little worm on her left cheek. The colonel wiped away the worm with his hand, covered up his wife's face, and reburied the coffin. Now, he had very little time, and he went directly to the airfield. The plane he needed wasn't there, but then a pilot in a charred jacket pulled him aside and said he was flying to the same place as the colonel and could drop him off. The colonel was surprised that the pilot knew where he was going, but then he saw it was the same pilot who had flown him home. "Are you all right?" asked the colonel. "I had a little crash on the way back," said the pilot, "but it's all right. I'll drop you off, it's on the way back." They flew at night. The colonel sat on a metal bench running the length of the plane. In truth, he was surprised the plane could fly at all. It was in terrible shape. Clumps of material hung everywhere. Some kind of charred stump kept rolling into the colonel's feet, and there was a strong odor of burned flesh. They soon landed, and the colonel asked the pilot if he was sure this was the right place. The pilot said he was absolutely sure. "Why is your plane in such poor shape?" the colonel demanded, and the pilot explained that his navigator usually cleaned up, but he'd just been killed. And right away he started lugging the charred stump off the plane, saying, "Well, there he is, my navigator." The plane stood in a field, and all through this field wandered wounded men. There was forest in every direction, a campfire burned in the distance, and among the burned-out cars and artillery, people were lying and sitting. Others were standing, and others were milling about. "Damn it!" the colonel yelled. "Where have you brought me? This isn't my base." "This is your base now," said the pilot. "I've brought you back to where I picked you up." The colonel understood that his division had been surrounded and destroyed, everyone killed or wounded, and he cursed everything on earth, including the pilot, who was still messing with his charred stump, which he insisted on calling his navigator, and pleading with it to get up and go. "Let's start evacuating everyone," ordered the colonel. "We'll begin with the military files, then the coat of arms and the heavily wounded." "This plane won't fly anymore," the pilot noted. The colonel drew his pistol and promised to shoot at the pilot then and there for disobeying an order. But the pilot ignored him and went on trying to stand the stump on the ground, first one way, then another, saying over and over, "Come on, let's go, let's go." The colonel fired his pistol, but he must have missed because the pilot kept mumbling, come on, let's go, come on," to his navigator, and in the meantime the roar of vehicles could be heard, and suddenly the field was filled with mechanized column of German infantry. The colonel took cover in the grass as the trucks kept coming and coming, but there was neither shooting nor shouting of orders, nor did the motors stop running. 10 minutes later, the column was gone, and the colonel raised his head. The pilot was still fussing with his chart stump, and over by the fire people were still lying down, sitting, walking around. The colonel stood and approached the fire. He didn't recognize anyone. This wasn't his division at all. There was infantry here, and artillery, and God knows what else, all in torn uniforms with open wounds on their arms, legs, stomachs. Only their faces were clean. They talked quietly among themselves. Next to the fire, her back to the colonel, sat a woman in civilian dress with a kerchief on her head. "Who's the senior officer here?" demanded the colonel. "I need an immediate report on the situation." No one moved, and no one paid any attention to the colonel when he started shooting. Although when the pilot finally managed to roll his chart stump over to them, everyone helped him throw his navigator on the flames and thereby put out the fire. It became completely dark. The colonel was shivering from the cold and began cursing again. "Now it would be impossible to get warm," he said. "You can't light a fire with a log like that." And without turning around, the woman by the fire said, "Oh, why did you look at my face? Why did you lift my veil? Now your arm is going to wither." It was the voice of the colonel's wife. The colonel lost consciousness, and when next he woke up, he was in a hospital. He was told that they'd found him in a cemetery next to his wife's grave, and that the arm on which he'd been lying was seriously injured, and now might have to be removed.